Hi, and welcome back. So I have been asked for some guidance on how do I make myself ready if I, as a doctor, want to go into another field? What is it that I need to do to become desirable? What can I do with my existing skills? Now, of course, this is a really difficult question to answer generically because what exactly you should be learning, or how you should be setting yourself up for that new future of yours really depends on where you come from, what you know, where you want to go into, what your talents are, and all of this. So, what I can try to give you within this video now is a set of heuristics that I think will apply generally and will have some value in getting you forward. But I, of course, can't give advice to everybody that will fully fit your situation. The first thing that I would like to draw your attention to is an advice that I've gotten when I studied in Cambridge in the first lecture, and it's something that I keep citing. And is that it's easy to figure out, relatively easy, to figure out the things that you need to learn. And often these are fairly clear-cut hard skills. Sometimes they're soft skills. But you also need to spend a considerable amount of time trying to figure out what the things are that you need to unlearn. Because you might have by now acquired a lot of different skills, behaviors, thought patterns, ways of communicating, and so on, that in one way or another made you successful in where you've gotten now. And it doesn't matter if you are still a medical student or a doctor or something like that. You have had successes, partially because of, also partially in spite of the way you have been going about solving these problems. And it is fallacious to assume that your next life with the next challenges will require the same approaches. So just to give you some concrete examples, I think that often as doctors, all we do is we sit or we stand somewhere and people come to us bringing up problems and we have to just deal with them and then move on to the next and move on to the next. Of course, take some notes and so on, but we're not usually required to do proper project management over weeks, structuring workload, delegating parts of the work really well, learning together as we go forward, creating demand for your business, so to speak. And these things might seem quite obvious, but they often come with a lot of implicit skills, adaptations that make you successful in dealing with that sort of environment. But if you take that very same attitude in a different setting, you are likely to maybe even frustrate your colleagues rather than being of instant value. And I often hear that when people work with doctors, that they are frustrated on, for example, around teamwork, on communication skills, and so on. So just become aware of that, just of the fact that learning is as important as unlearning, and that you need to spend a considerable amount of time to figure out what are the things you need to unlearn. And frankly, this is often much more difficult to figure out than the learning part, because it's more personal, because it's often less tangible, and you will just simply also find fewer articles around this. A second thing that generally I would like you to consider is in medicine, usually the goal is that you end up focusing a lot on one specialty, and then maybe even you subspecialize further. And the narrower you get, often the better. This might not be the case in the new fields that you are looking for. There it could very well be that they're looking for somebody who has more generalist skills, a broad toolkit, and is able to interface with a lot of different people. And that might be particularly true for you in your medical role as you step out into a new profession where you have to make sure that the skills you have can be conveyed, and the knowledge that you have can be conveyed to somebody who is not medically trained, and then can use that knowledge that you give them and do something meaningful with it, right? So your ability to interface is hugely important. And there is a strategic aspect to it when it comes to career planning. So if you only want to be good in one thing, that typically means that if you want to be excellent, that you have to end up in the top 2% or maybe even better. And to get there, you have to spend a lot of time. And it also can get boring at some point. Plus, that's economics, right? So for every unit of time that you invest more, the marginal gain, the extra unit that you gain from it, they will start to decrease. But your cost of investing more, also emotional cost and so on, that will increase. And so really getting into this 2% is often hard, not nice, and not so desirable. But if you think about trying to become very good, top 15% or something like this, in 2 or more areas, let's not do too many, but a couple. So for me, for example, it's medicine, it is the whole digital world, and it is business. So I can combine these three, and there are very few people who bring that set of combination of skills. And then if you turn that into a Venn diagram with this 3 circles, or maybe it's 2 for you, maybe it's 4, and you find jobs at the intersection of this, where all of these skills are equally needed, or to some degree more or less equally needed, then you're in a precious space. But the point is that getting very good versus excellent in an area is easier. And if you do it with 2 different areas, then getting very good also becomes a bit easier. It depends on your personality. I like to see like broader topics and look at the problem from different angles. So for me, it really fits. If it's not, you can stick with the deep specialization part. But given that you're watching this because in all likelihood you are considering to move out, you will probably have to find this other component next to clinical medicine. It could be data science, could be writing, could be leadership, politics, I don't know, whatever it is, you would know. So that's great. And also it gives you more flexibility, because let's say if you don't like this other stuff, you can go back, but you can still use these skills, right? And that is playing it a bit more safe, while creating a situation for yourself where you become quite unique thanks to your blend of skills. The third aspect, and I hope that this is quite obvious to you, but it's you are anyway signed up for a lifelong learning journey. And I know that in medicine, we keep telling ourselves this. There is continuous medical education in many countries. You have to constantly get points for further education so that you can stay certified or progress or whatever. The same applies in other fields. And frankly, the pace of innovation is going so fast that you will probably even have to allocate more time than you used to in trying to stay up to date. And I still see a lot of people in the industry who think that the master degree that they got 7 years ago is all they need, and the rest is professional experience. The problem with pure professional experience is that you often stay within the well-threaded path, the things that you need to know. You're not so aware of the things you don't know, and that you don't know. But the things that you don't know are more important for you in general than the things that you don't know, or the things that you know. And so going on structured learning paths, actively seeking out new information, new skills, also outside of your key field, is something that will truly make a difference. And it has compound interest. So you will learn things now that make it easier for you to perform well in whatever you're doing. But also it will shape your thinking for the future. It will give you more informed conversations with other people from which you can then in turn learn more. And also when you then start to learn something new and yet something new, the value of what you're learning can typically increase because you can connect it with the other things that you have already learned. And so all of this taken together makes it increasingly valuable to add more diverse knowledge to whatever it is that you're doing. Another aspect, we are now in a time where so much is changing so fast, especially with at the moment, large language models, generative AI. So a question that I always or often get, and things that I also think about for myself, for my team, and so on, is what is the relevant skill to learn now? If things are changing so fast, if much of the intellectual capabilities of humans are starting to become commoditized, what should I learn? Right? Does it still make sense to learn programming these days when there's a famous talk by an ex-Harvard computer scientist professor who says, well, it's the end of programming. It will take a few more years and then we will not be seeing programming anymore because it is a dysfunctional language that humans created to talk to machines. Now we can talk to them, as you know, with GPT and so on. And they can just translate that not into code, but into ones and zeros and go straight for the language of machines without that intermediary. So do we still need to learn programming? Guess it depends. I personally wouldn't. And so that's something to think about. But there are things that we can be fairly certain will stay relevant also in 10 years. And rather than just looking at what's going to change, it's always good to also think about what will actually not change, what is very likely to stay stable, because that is much easier to build plans around, right? And so things that fall into that category of constants is good self-management, time management, task management. It's good teamwork, different ways of communicating, documenting, and so on. It's being able at giving good feedback, at receiving feedback. Like the softer skills, for example, understanding data, understanding the fundamentals of business, understanding some legal fundamentals wherever you work. All of these things can really, really be very useful, and then also surely in the future. Even if you have computers explaining to you the law, you have to be able to make some sense of it. Just like when you would ask a computer now for medical advice, you will pick up on things that don't make sense or that might make sense, but not in this context, or that, you get where the machine is coming from, but you actually have some other information that makes this less likely, etc., etc. So being able to become a good digester of information is also quite a good skill to have going forward. But then, of course, there are things that might be very specific to what you want to go into. So how do you find out which skills you should be learning? A very simple thing is to just ask Google or ask ChatGPT. Just put your CV in ChatGPT, say, hey, this is me, this is what I want to go into. And maybe if you find some job descriptions, copy them in the text, right? And say, what do you think I should be learning in order to become a premium candidate, given that job description? Or if you don't have a job description, just say, I'm a doctor, I want to become a data scientist in medicine. What do I need to learn, right? Or I want to become a hospital manager. What are the skills that you think I should be learning? And you can Google that. You can also just look at most in-demand skills for 2024. That's a Googleable term where you get a lot of interesting results, and they're often quite comparable. And then you just look at these different skills, you look at where you can learn them, and that's where you can build out your own kind of portfolio of things you would like to learn. And then what I also recommend is look at your role models, people that you think you would like to have a career that's similar to theirs. Look at as many job descriptions in the areas that are of interest to you online, and try to distill, okay, what are in this skills sections, they often tell you exactly what they're looking for. But even in the sort of unstructured text part where they describe the job role and so on, then you can distill some keywords that you can turn into a personal curriculum for yourself. And that's something I anyway would do. But then also it can be very, very helpful for you to look into another structured learning program. So you might maybe, want to do an MBA or a degree in public policy, or whatever it might be, because they have then done this prioritization of skills for you, and it is a longer structured process. You will meet other people that are on a similar journey as you, maybe coming from a completely different field. So it might not even be medicine, but there's so much that you can then also learn from them. Whatever it is that you choose, of course, it's a matter of budget, but typically as doctors, you often have some privileges. It might be easier to get into a program because they like to have doctors in there. They know that they're hardworking. They know that they bring in a very important perspective for many degrees. And it's interesting to have doctors in diverse programs. Secondly, there are often additional study grants depending on where you live. Also for people with a sort of new aspirations for a second career. And also here, if you're a doctor, often it's appreciated because the funders will know that it's very likely that you will be setting out to do something that has a strong social value. Aside from the finances, if you can't fund it, whatever it is you want to do, you will find a lot of good online resources for free, including YouTube has a wealth of content, and that's a good point to start. And then many things you can just try out. You can use ChatGPT as your personal coach, and you just become an autodidact for the moment. That is completely fine. Whatever you choose in terms of how you want to learn should also be something that is determined by what gives you most joy. Make sure that that you like the learning format, that you like the content. Your life has been hard already. You have studied a lot of things that I suppose you didn't enjoy. Some of them, of course, you did. But now is also the time to do things that intrinsically spark your interest, your curiosity. You already have a job. You have already proven yourself to the market with a very, very tough degree that you have achieved, and probably you have worked already in quite a demanding field. So it's time also to do more things that just create enjoyment for you as you are learning. These are the main things in that sense. The other aspect that I would like to highlight is that you need to understand the difference between knowing things and knowing what to do with the things that you know, and the latter is far more important. So as doctors, you already have a lot of knowledge and skills, and in many cases, people outside of the hospital will be interested in working with you because of your knowledge. But I often find it very hard for doctors to really make use of that in a new context, because they might be too dogmatic about some things. They might be mixing their personal opinion with a scientific fact, and that makes it hard for the non-medics to get in a good conversation with you that is meaningful. The whole use of jargon and so on, not understanding that there are other priorities other than clinical effectiveness. You also have, it has to be viable, meaning somebody has to be paying for the thing enough to sustain your business, and also to pay fairly early and not go through a whole reimbursement route where you have to negotiate with insurance companies or the NHS over years. And then maybe you get it in the end, but your company is bankrupt by then, right? So viability is an important aspect. Desirability is an important aspect. Like, people need to actually want to use it. It could be the best scientifically proven tool, but if it's not designed in an empathetic way that people want to use it, it's not going to be used. Look at the big questionnaires that we sometimes ask patients to fill out. Dropout rates can be tremendous. And ultimately, it also has to be technically feasible, right? So I see doctors who have these great ideas, or from a regulatory perspective, feasible, or feasible in terms of it fits into the day-to-day. And so I see a lot of startups that come up with something where it's clearly desirable, it's clearly clinically effective, and there might be somebody paying for it at some point, but it just doesn't fit into the day-to-day because it requires doctors to work 5 minutes extra per patient, or because there's a data protection issue that stands in the way, or so many barriers are possible, and you have to be aware of them, and you have to, as a doctor, not just come from your old world, but start to see the whole aspect of innovation. So that's just, I'm just talking about a startup example now. If you go into different fields, then there will be comparable situations. That's something to keep in mind. In order to understand this deeply, you need practice. So you need to be good at engaging with other teams, and you need to solicit feedback from them as often as you can. You need to listen to how do they speak, what are their concerns, like really try to understand them deeply. And there's the saying, show me your friends and I show you your future. If you're only hanging out with other doctors and you keep staying in that world, in that way of thinking, then it's not so likely that you will find it easy to connect with others. If you spend a lot of time with different people, one of my best friends is a lawyer, the other one works in finance, I have a lot of startup friends, people working in the political field. So that makes it very natural for me to change my way of thinking, to prioritize different aspects of a decision, etc. And I can only recommend that. Like, really try to build a diverse environment for you professionally, and if you can personally, and really try to adopt the learning mindset constantly and figure out where are your blind spots. I think these are the key aspects that I think you should be considering. Just one parting thought, and I touched on it earlier. So we are now seeing an era where more and more intellectual capabilities are being taken over by machines, by artificial intelligence that previously humans could do. So knowledge is getting commoditized, and especially in medicine, people that are now in charge, that are leading a lot of the politics, science, and so on within the medical world, they are still socialized in a time where acquiring a lot of factual knowledge was what really made you good and what differentiated you, what set you apart. This was part of your job within that profession, because it was so hard to get access to that data. You had to go to a library, rent a book, then it wasn't there. You could only have it for a couple of weeks. So it was really important to memorize a lot. And it still is, frankly, because if you have an emergency, you will not have time to look things up. And there's the saying that many of you will know, is that you can only see something if you know it. And a radiologist once taught me that. So you have to have your own pattern recognition, of course. But increasingly, much of the access to knowledge is delegated to machines. And so the question then becomes, if that's becoming cheap and available, where is your possibility to differentiate yourself and to add value? And it's, of course, then more the things that the machines cannot do so easily. Part of that is manual skills, might not be so relevant. Part of that can be empathy, although they're also giving the impression that they're very empathetic in the way they write. There were studies in the medical field where ChatGPT seemed to be more empathetic than patients on, I think it was Quora questions and so on. Of course, the humans didn't have the time. They didn't know that they were going to be compared on that front, but that's beside the point. Like, at least machines can also give that sentiment across. But yeah, your character, process management, helping organizations adopt these new technologies. So that's called digital transformation, I think, is an important skill to have. And it's frankly not easy, because it has a psychological component, a management component, a strategic component, technological component, ethical, legal, and so on. So that's something that I think is always worth getting better and better at. But it's something that we need to keep revisiting all over again. So I hope that helped you a little bit to get some heuristics on things to consider when you as a doctor want to leave the clinic and become valuable somewhere else. And the core message is you will constantly have to revisit that. So I wish you good luck, And I hope you liked these reflections.